In this lesson, we're going to learn how to speed up our render pipeline by rendering out either every other frame or every 4 frames so that we can get an incredible amount of time savings while only making our animation a little bit jitterier. So I've just opened up 09 Begin, and I've got this relatively expensive scene to render. And we have some animation on it, so I would like to be able to preview this, but I do not want to wait around while NUKE pre-renders this into my cache. So one way around this is to actually just write out a sample sequence. Now, of course, we looked earlier at writing out proxies, and we could do that, or we might need to write this out at the full res. Now, of course, writing this out at full res means that we're going to be writing this out or rendering it very slowly, depending on our scene. So if we want to see our animation, but we do not want to wait for every single frame to render, we can actually render every other frame or every 3 frames, every 4 frames, and we'll save either half of our time, 2/3 of our time, or 3/4 of our time, or 75% by rendering it out this way. Now we're going to see less keyframes, so let's just come in here, drop in a write node with the W key, and I'm just going to write this out to my project files, and I'm just going to render this out into a render folder. We can call this, let's see, every other frame. Let's see, %03d.exr, just giving us the usual padding and the usual frame format. Okay. And now we will render this as we would normally, and this is actually something we do at the render setting. So if we hit F7, we see our frame range is 1 to 185. And to render out every other frame, we would hit ×2 or x2. And this is going to say, okay, instead of rendering every frame, I'm only going to render out every other frame. So if we click OK, you can see instead of rendering out 185 frames, we're actually rendering out 93 frames. So our render is literally going to go twice as fast as it would normally. Now, it's still, of course, going to take the time it needs to render this out. So I'm just going to pause the video while this completes. It's probably going to take about another 20 seconds because these later frames are a little bit more complex. Alright, so that just completed rendering, and you might try coming into your write node and hitting the read file button, but this is actually, the write node is missing the setting we need for this missing frames property. So let's hit the R key to drop in a read node, and let's select our new sequence, and you can see it looks a little strange because we're again only rendering out every other frame. Click OK and hit 1 to view this in our viewer. And we can see if we hit play, we have every other frame's data, but we're getting this really annoying error dialog box. And to get around that, we can change the read node missing frame to nearest frame. Now, depending on your system, this may work correctly out of the box, or you might need to come in and actually just click reload. And now we're actually seeing every other frame of our animation. And so most of the time, we're not going to be able to tell the difference. Of course, we are missing some fidelity or some render or animation data. But as you can see, we can really get a good view and a good feel of the timing for what we need to modify. And so rendering every other frame is a great way to see the animation without spending a lot of time rendering. Now, if we want to go even further, we can render out every 4th frame. And we come in here and let me just type in 4th frame. And to do this, we can type in, just hit F7 and a ×4. And this will render out every 4th frame. So instead of 185 frames, we have 47, saving us an incredible amount of time. So you can see here, barely finished saying that sentence, and it's already 90% or 75% of the way through our composition. If we had hit render, we maybe would have gotten to 30 or 50 by this point, but by utilizing this rendering technique of only rendering out a few frames, we're able to create previews much faster than with the normal workflows. Now, of course, being able to use this depends heavily on the complexity of the animation in your scene and how much you actually need to see. If you need to see every single frame, or if the motion is going over 10 frames, then you're probably going to need to render that out. But for longer animations or longer sequences, this is a valid technique or a valid workflow for seeing changes and movement. So we can see here with the every fourth frame, our animation is much more jittery and much more jumpy, but we're still getting a good idea of what this is going to look like in the final render. So in this lesson, we learned how we can use the advanced editing or the advanced features of our write node here by going to the render menu and going to either X2, X4, or you can really do any numerator or any multiplican that you want here. You could do every 8th frame if you would need to, and that will of course render out much faster than any other method. So remember, if you just need to take a look at the animation, but you need to see it at a higher quality level, you can render out every other frame to essentially cut your render time in half. Now at the end, we're going to have to render out every frame. This is, of course, but for all previewing purposes and right before we hit the final render button, I almost never render out every single frame because we want to be able to see things quickly and easily so we can make changes quickly and easily.